Good morning, everybody, and encouraging this reflective ability we have as human forms. And it's changing from, I found, the Western cultural attitudes are very materialistic. So that's, we think of that even in theories of evolution and so forth, it's matter, and then matter gave birth to consciousness, and then forms developed that were conscious. So this is the materialistic view that the universe was established in matter, and because look at that, one thing that matter does is it's very obvious. You look at Singapore, it's all buildings and parks and people and things that are made out of matter. So much of our worldview is based on this belief that matter is the origin of everything. So then in the Buddhist and Hindu philosophies, it's consciousness, that matter manifests in consciousness, and this seems more accurate, even as a scientific approach, because consciousness, it's where wisdom can manifest, where intelligence can manifest, but rocks and mountains and matter and planets are can't create anything other than just procreate the species or reinforce the matter or let it decay and disappear. So just and because of the American materialistic conditioning, then coming across the Buddhist perspective was like a revolution. Suddenly things began to make much more sense to me, just starting from that view that consciousness is where the world manifests, where the forms manifest, where the mountains, the trees, the people, the oceans, the sun, moon, and stars, the planets, the galaxies all manifest in space, and space manifests in consciousness. So to try to reinforce this is a kind of revolutionary attitude. It was prevalent in ancient India from before Buddhism. So it's not something like a revolutionary new discovery. It's just been ignored. Forgotten. So consciousness doesn't have language, so it can't conceive itself as an object. Consciousness is very functional, and it knows itself, but it doesn't know anything else. So forms manifest in space, in consciousness, and then the knowing starts through defining experience through the senses, through seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking. So actually, consciousness is unknowingness, and open unknowingness is something I am, not something I know. So when I ask you the question, are you conscious? Immediately you're going to say yes, because consciousness knows itself, but it doesn't know itself as an object. So this is, in terms of language, is impossible to really define, because unknowingness, knowing itself, and we think of knowing, the knowing that we identify with is through the objects, knowing the objects that we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, what we've been, our memories and emotions we can know. But you can't know yourself as an object, as consciousness is what you actually are. Where when we know ourselves as a form, as a person, as a man or woman, then we have, that depends on language, on other sankhara forms that we can define. I am a Buddhist monk, I am Ajahn Asoko, the statement I am doesn't define me. Just the English personal pronoun and the verb am, when you think I and am, it's still quite impersonal, it's just a statement of presence, being here and now. But then I am Ajahn Sumedho, that defines me in this form. I am 88 years old, that's the identity with the body. So just exploring the ability to think, when we say I am, it doesn't say what you are in any way, just a statement, a verbal statement of presence, of being. And then I am Ajahn Sumedho defines this, who this being, this experience is, how I define myself as a person, as a personality, as a form. So these kind of exercises are good to explore, because we're so conditioned, it's so ingrained in our habit patterns to identify ourselves with forms. But I am conscious is a reasonable thing to say. So if I ask you, are you conscious, you reply, I am conscious. You don't have to ask somebody whether you're conscious or not. And I remember years ago, and I was still, when consciousness became a great subject of interest, and I was interested in my youth in modern psychology and Freudian psychology and Jungian psychology, and then how they regard consciousness, what these famous Austrian psychologists called consciousness. And so I'd go to the library and read what Freud said about consciousness, or Carl Jung said about consciousness. And then one day I was heading toward the library, I was going, what does the Pali dictionary say about consciousness? How does the Pali dictionary define consciousness? And as I was going toward the library, I suddenly realized, why do I have to go to a library to find out consciousness? This is what it is. I'm this consciousness that I'm experiencing. And suddenly that was like an insight, just walking from one place to the next. Why do I have to depend on the Pali dictionary to define consciousness when I am the consciousness itself? And this is an interesting subject these days because Western science, Western psychiatry, Western psychology is very interested in defining consciousness, and I think it's the brain. Most psychologists think that the brain is our consciousness. But the brain is an organ of the body, it's a physical organ. And it's more like a computer. It's where the conditioned languages appear and we create these various definitions and preferences and what's good and what's bad through thinking. Thinking is a brain function. But consciousness isn't thinking. It's not something, the word itself is merely a skillful means pointing to the reality of being here and now. Because that's what we can know at any moment, wherever we are, whatever condition we're in, we're here, and the time is now, the place is here, the time is now. We can imagine going to another place, that's the future, or remember coming from another place, and that's the past. But just to reiterate, that experience is always here and now. And it's conscious awareness, where we're not seeking objects anymore. We're not trying to define consciousness or find our true nature or ourself, but we begin to realize we don't have to find who we are. We are this pure awareness, conscious awareness. So many questions have been asked about the Bhutto mantra, and that is another word that I found very useful in developing in meditation, because I didn't know anything about it till I met Luang Por Sumedho. And that Thai forest tradition coming from Ajahn Mun, who died long before I came around, but Luang Por Sumedho was basing his kind of style of teaching on Ajahn Mun, who was a Thai Ajahn in northeast Thailand. So Luang Por Sumedho taught me the mantra Bhutto. Now this is a two-syllable word, it's the name of the Buddha. And then you can use it. At first, because I was such a rabid thinker, I couldn't get anywhere because I was always thinking, doubting. I was trying, before I met Luang Por Sumedho, I was trying to get jhanas and get samadhi, and this was all, the desire to. These were words that sounded desirable. Samadhi sounded desirable. Jhana sounded incredibly desirable. And so, reading Visuddhimagga, I started practicing according to instructions on jhana and so forth. So, it was an experiment, But, I began to realize that I'm trying to get something I don't have, something I don't even know what it is. But it sounds good, just like going to heaven or the two-seater heaven in the cosmology of Buddhism. So I think I'd like to be born in the two-seater heaven where everything is beautiful and happy. That's a desirable place to want. We all want beauty and happiness and sunshine and good health and vigorous youth and good-looking appearance. And there's no ugly devas in the two-seater heaven. And I haven't ever figured out whether there were male and female devas, but anyway, you can create anything you want about two-seater heaven, but it sounds like a heavenly place to go to, where earthly experience in these food bodies, in these heavy bodies that we have to feed all the time, deal with its sensitivity, its pains, its growth, and all the problems that arise with old age, sickness, and death. A deva body sounds very desirable. So this because of Luang Por Chah's emphasis on awareness, I always interpreted awareness as awareness of objects. Crossing the street. When you're skiing or ice skating, you have to be aware. When you're walking on a busy street, you have to be aware so you're not crashing into people. And when you're climbing a rock cliff, you have to be aware. But your awareness depends on objects, so objective awareness through seeing and feeling, hearing. But sati sampajanya, these words are pure conscious awareness of itself. And the only way you can describe that, it's like this. Well, to deal with a very active thinking habit, I found Puto, at first Luang Por Chah told me to use it with breathing practices, anapanasati, inhale on Put, exhale on To. So I found that anapanasati was, because my mind wandered so quickly, and I'd start thinking, is this right? Am I doing it properly? And when I would get a level of peace and samadhi, then I'd say, is this jhana? And then the peaceful, tranquil state would disappear. And so there's an endless struggle to try to get something. And when you do get something tranquil, then you think, is this first jhana, or can I get second jhana? And so your mind is taking these words out of scriptural teachings or Visuddhimagga, and you're not aware that the ego wants to get jhanas as a person, as an egotistical male. I want to get jhanas, I want to get samadhi, I want to go to the two-seater heaven, I'd like to get psychic powers to visit these deva realms while I'm still a monk. It sounds very kind of a way of getting out of the boredom of monastic life. So getting these incredible psychic powers and jhanas and high levels of concentration are desirable objects. Now just point, there's nothing wrong with this, but awareness is awareness that these are creations through words, through language, through reading books, through hearing lectures. And so we grasp these definitions or these ideals of perfection, of beauty and eternal happiness because they're very desirable ideals. But the way life is we experience in daily life, here and now, is like this. It's not always beautiful or pleasant or happy. And we've got these heavy bodies to deal with. And we have to feed and deal with their excretory functions throughout the day and deal with sickness, being disabled or diseases. So the earthly realm is like this. The way it is the earthly realm is the inexorable changingness of phenomena. And this we can have insight into. And this is the whole purpose of the Buddhist teachings, was to encourage us to start seeing with these wisdom teachings, rather than from the conditioning, the personal identities, or even holding on to the scriptural teachings, just the words and the concepts. Like jhana is a good word, it's a good concept, but what is it, in terms of here and now? Now some people can get jhanas very quickly, but most educated people, because we think so much, we doubt. And doubt is one of the main obstructions to jhana. Now thinking like in northeastern Thailand, where a lot of the disciples of Luang Por were just illiterate villagers, rice farmers, they didn't think that much. They weren't educated to be highly critical, or they had more practical relations with their bodies and the world. And they oftentimes found it very easy to get jhanas. But when you're dealing with educated people, just realize all of us have been educated, highly educated. And that's the kind of goal that I was encouraged to develop since I started school, was to get educated, to go to university, get degrees. And that's an American idea of success and what people should be, to be educated. But then in meditation, just trying to think and reason and make everything reasonable and sensible and have clear definitions for all the Pali words and so forth Pali scholars endlessly quibble over the meaning of suffering, of dukkha, and what is nibbana, and what is, these are words that we try to translate into English, and then we want to get the perfect English word for dukkha, for suffering. And that's the thinking mind wants to do that. The ego, the Sakyaditi, wants to define everything with some word that's a creation in whatever language possible. So what isn't a word? You can't define, or there's no word. We call it consciousness, but that's a word we've created in English, vijnana in Pali. So which is should we use vijnana all the time, or consciousness, or suffering? Should we? Suffering isn't good enough to change it to something else, because we want to get the perfect translations from Pali, Sanskrit into English language. And this is, what are we doing? We're getting caught up with our thinking mind, our idea of our worship of words, concepts, education, all that conditioning. And when we come to Buddhism, to Buddhist meditation, we bring that burden with us. So in just speaking for myself, the burden I'd create with my non-stop thinking habit patterns, and which would always create doubt, uncertainty. Is this first jhana, or is this tranquility? Should I get more tranquility before I do vipassana? Because you get advice about you've got to get this level of tranquility to do vipassana, and then you try to get you're not quite sure what level of tranquility you can enter vipassana with, and you get caught up in endless doubts that, from the words that you hear from others, from teachers, and then, we find it rather despairing. I can't get samadhi, I don't have good mindfulness. I met in England people who've been practicing meditation for decades who are still trying to get perfect samadhi. When they can't do it. In some moments you get a level of tranquility, under certain conditions, in retreats or in living in a cave or some remote place where nothing distracts you. So you get, because like sensory deprivation, where you deprive your senses of their objects, and you get a level of tranquility naturally comes because there's not the objects to the senses that distract us, or there's not so many. And then I remember going to a monastery where, before I ordained, I was looking for the monastery I wanted to ordain in, and they had a very strict method of meditation. And so I asked one of the monks there, I said, when you go to Bangkok, can you still keep this level of concentration? And he says, no, don't go to Bangkok, you can't meditate in Bangkok. And so I thought, what good is this if I have to stay out in the forest my whole life and avoid everything, and then see Bangkok as a place where it's going to ruin my practice. This is all mental proliferation. Is Bangkok a obstruction to mindfulness or wisdom? Is Singapore an obstruction? Can you really get enlightened in Singapore? Get real insight or wisdom in a very crowded city? And you think about it, you're going to doubt it's impossible, or I don't think, how you see yourself, whether you see yourself in critical terms and you believe your critical attitudes about yourself or about Singapore. But what transcends Singapore and forests and caves and emotional tranquility is awareness. Awareness is our true nature, whether you're in Bangkok, Singapore, or a forest monastery. But when we think about Singapore or Bangkok, we can think, well, it is, it's a very distracting place. Going to, when you've been, remember in Chithurst in England, I spent several months in the forest meditating. Then I had to go to London, and I was really very tranquil and peaceful. And somebody met me, picked me up in a car, and as we left Chithurst, I began to just notice the impingement as you go into Midhurst and you go on the motorway to London. And when you're in London, there's endless advertisements, billboards, and buildings, and fashion shops, and people, and living in a quiet forest refuge in Chithurst is one thing. But what do you do when you're in a busy city like London? What is it that is the same whether it's in a forest refuge or a busy city? Is awareness is always here and now. So if I believe that you can't meditate in Singapore because it's too crowded, too noisy, that's a belief that you might grasp. It's easy to believe that when you think of meditation as peace and quiet. But vipassana is insight into the way things are, and the way things are always the way they are in the moment, whether you're in a forest refuge or in a busy city. And getting back to Puto, I found I couldn't even concentrate, with using Bu and then To on the inhalation, exhalation, my mind would wander. So I started using Puto as just a mantra. So I began to just think Puto, 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 and every time a thought started arising, I'd substitute it with Puto. I'd even go Puto, 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 and when I started my habitual thinking habits, eventually, just as a mantra, just by using Puto as a mantra, then I began to slow down. I began to stop thinking. I began to notice that my rabid, incessant thinking habit was slowing down. So it was a way I could learn to use anapanasati. At first I used the mantra because it's another word that you're using and not allowing yourself to think any other word but Puto. So, just practicing with that, I began to get some good results towards stopping this rapid thinking, doubting, worrying. And then I began to use the Puto on inhalation, exhalation. Eventually you can let go of Puto and just be the awareness of the inhalation is like this, the exhalation is like this. Well, that's important thing because we're breathing here and now. It's an object easy to recognize. Wherever you are, you're breathing. When you're not breathing, that means you're dead. So breathing but it's always here and now. The experience of anapanasati is always now, here in whatever place, whether in busy street in Singapore or a forest cave. So then, when I was a samanera, before I met Luang Por Sumedho, I spent a year in this meditation monastery. in Nong Khai province, and which is on the Mekong River, right across from Laos, the country of Laos. And so there I began to notice, because I was isolated in a kuti, I didn't have to go to meetings or anything, and they brought food once a day, and then nobody could speak English in this monastery, so I had just a book on the Four Noble Truths, and I began to just investigate, and sometimes I'd get so peaceful, my mind, I began to notice this, what I call sound of silence, a kind of background resonating kind of, I could call it a sound, but it's not really a sound. It's the background, it's conscious awareness itself. But I didn't know that. So I just thought, well, the Buddha said everything is impermanent, so there must be impermanent. So then I kept hearing this, what they call sound of silence, this vibration, internal vibration. And I'd forget it and get caught up with other things. And then I think that it had disappeared, but it was always here and now. So following that kind of thing, I wondered what it was, whether you could hold on to it or grasp it instead of Puto. Or before I met Luang Por Chah, I used let go, and then when I met Luang Por Chah, I started using Puto. But right now I notice this vibration. As I'm sitting here talking like this, I'm aware of it constantly. What is it? You can't find a description of it, like sound of silence. Silence, it's an oxymoron, it doesn't make sense. Silence is where there's no sound. But then it's not a sound. Sounds have a beginning and an ending. So you have do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. They all have sharps and flats and so forth. Sounds pleasant or unpleasant all come and go and change. But sound of silence is always here and now. So using that as a reference point in Thailand, in Wat Pah Pong, they'd often, when I began to understand Thai language, Luang Por Chah would be talking about Jit Wang, which translates as empty consciousness. So Jit Wang, empty consciousness, began to, because I was learning Thai, I oftentimes wondered what it was. And then using the word sound of silence was a bit of a confusing way of describing it. So I never told anybody, never told Luang Por Chah or anybody about it. And then in London, the first 2 years we were in England, we lived in London, in Hampstead. And when I arrived in London, the English Sangha Trust, which had invited me and Luang Por Chah to England, the members of this trust were having a terrible, quarrelsome battle, which I had to attend these meetings, and they'd really be vicious towards each other. One side wanted to keep the Hampstead Vihara and just live there. The other side wanted to sell the Hampstead Vihara and move to the countryside or the forest. And so I was caught in the middle of this, not being torn. Both had kind of reasonable things to say about each side. They weren't lacking in reason, but getting confused of taking sides and who was right and who was wrong. What is the best to do now? Stay in London or move out of London? Who's going to feed us out of London? All these kind of speculations and worries. Then one day I was in the summertime. I was walking down Haverstock Hill, which was a busy street just outside the Hampstead Vihara, and a very noisy street. And I still remember the exact spot where I remembered the sound of silence. This what I call sound of silence seemed like it attacked me right on the streets of Haverstock Hill. And suddenly I remembered this. I hadn't really used it very much in Thailand. So then I thought, this might be a way to resolve this conflict. So I started developing an incredible awareness of this vibration, and I could go to these meetings, these acrimonious meetings, and go into silence, not be caught in my thinking process, because the sound of silence, you stop thinking completely. And then I suddenly had more insight. I knew what to do. So I told one side they had to leave and resign, and they actually did. And then from then on, the miracle of Chithurst appeared, a beautiful part of England, really lovely, picturesque part of southern England, and on like that. But it's through this empty conscious awareness, Jit Wang, empty consciousness is like this. It's silent, all the time silent. And then the noise is our thoughts, our emotional habits, what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, feel, think is all noise, sound, movement, manifestations of conditioned phenomena, moving, changing in consciousness. So then Bhutto, I can let go of that and just increase this trust in silent awareness in Chithurst, in Amaravati. So people like to ask me, do you suffer anymore? Ask me if I still suffer. And so, in terms of physical experience, as I still feel very, when I walk, I have to depend on other people or a walking stick, or a mini frame or something like that, because I feel very unstable. Is that suffering? Do I create suffering around the limitations of my feet and legs? So in ultimate reality, there's no suffering. As a physical form, there's still discomfort and pain and so forth. That's just the way it is. Another thing is grief. You get the impression that if you're fully enlightened, you don't feel grief. And so, this is the impression I had anyway, that arahants didn't grieve. And so then we all had to, in my monastic life, I had to witness the loss of Luang Por Cha, my mother and father, my sister, my friends, supporters. This past year has been a lot of very wonderful supporters have passed away. What do I feel? Do I feel totally indifferent to when people who you love or close to die and go away from you? Is there suffering in that? Do I create suffering around the loss of my mother or father or sister? I can do that as a person. But as the silent witness, I still feel the sadness of loss, because that's natural. I can still cry, because that's natural. The body's nature is to cry, and so when the sad perceptions are manifested, that's natural. Do I take that personally? Do I take that sadness and make it into some kind of personal identity? Or is it just a natural karmic condition of being human, being a human being? So when my mother died, I was... I'd visited my mother they lived in, and my sister lived in San Diego. My father had died the previous year, and so I went that year to see my mother in San Diego. She was living with my sister, and we had a very nice time, and they respected what I do as a Buddhist monk, even though they were Christians. So then when I was going to fly up to Oakland, California, I was going to give a 10-day meditation retreat in San Francisco area. So my mother and my sister drove my mother and myself to the airport, San Diego airport, said goodbye to my mother, and she seemed all right. She was 88 years old. And then I flew to Oakland. I spent the night at a friend's house in Oakland. And the next morning my sister telephoned me at this house and said that mother had passed away that night. So then I had to start giving a 10-day retreat with this kind of sadness. Because your mother is, is one that gives you birth and nurtures you when you're a helpless infant. So there's a lot of love and memories regarding mother. Just the word mother can create all kinds of emotional feelings. So I went to, they had a beautiful retreat center in Sonoma County, which is just north of San Francisco. So I went there. It was the first 5 days of the retreat. It was a 10-day retreat. I could teach, and I wasn't externally grieving. But there was certainly this sense of sadness and loss of a mother. And then the funeral was in San Diego. They were Catholics. So a friend of mine took over the retreat in Sonoma, and I flew to San Diego and went to this Catholic funeral and went to the cemetery where they buried my mother, and then I flew back to San Francisco, went to this retreat and continued the retreat. And I did feel tears would come with a memory of loss of mother. It's natural. Is it personal? It becomes personal when I think, if I had more mindfulness, I wouldn't be crying. Because that's the illusion I had that I'd heard from others. But my insight, direct insight was this: the body is a crying form. That's its nature. When you go to the movies and you see sad things happen to people, and you find tears in your eyes with either joy or sorrow. This is the body. This is what the body does. To try to stop that and suppress it is very personality that has, you don't show emotion, stiff upper lip, don't cry, be a man up, and don't let people know your state of mind. This is the stiff upper lip approach. Don't be emotional, embarrass everybody. Is oftentimes the view of Western European American society. But that's not natural. That's a created perception of good behavior created by unwise human beings who don't understand themselves. So, for understanding one's own humanity is you have more compassion for others too, because you're not making judgments about, don't make a scene, don't embarrass the family and break down and cry, and don't, all these prohibitions, ways of proper etiquette and proper social behavior are learned, what we learn in our youth. But are they natural? Is the body, it has these tears, it's natural, it's a condition of being a man or a woman. It's like this. So in terms of awareness, there's no suffering. In terms of the physical experiences of old age and sickness, loss of the loved, grief, sorrow, despair, and anguish, they arise and cease according to conditions. But with wisdom, you see them as conditions arise and cease. You don't grasp anymore. So the enlightened human being is not indifferent or cold to the sadness of life or the problems of being human. You don't become just a kind of heartless, cold feeling form, but your humanity is understood, so you're no longer identifying as a human. The human body does its thing according to its nature, according to conditioning. But you don't grasp it anymore, identifying with it, but you're aware of it. And it's like this. So Putto can be used as a mantra, as a help for concentrating on the inhalation, exhalation, and then as you have more confidence, as you recognize, you're aware of what's going on, the effect that these mantras, this practice of concentrating on the breath is like this. you calm down and you're more aware, but you're aware inwardly. You're not using it to engage in external objects of the senses, but in recognizing your true nature, conscious awareness, Phuto, and Dhamma, apparent here and now, timeless. So I offer this for reflection.